Hi everyone, continuing on with lecture 25, we're going to 25C now and starting our discussion of HIV. This is what the virus looks like on an electron micrograph, so with an electron microscope, really high power. So what we're seeing is lots of little tiny virus particles, which are little bits of genetic material surrounded by a protein shell. So this is what HIV looks like. So 25C, we're going to talk about the history of HIV, and then we're going to talk about how it is transmitted. So we're pretty sure that this disease originally came from somewhere on the African continent. The virus seems to have developed in some species of monkey and then kind of made the jump to humans. But interestingly, there are probable human cases dating as far back as 1884 based on some surviving documents. But we know for sure that someone was definitely infected with it in 1959. This was someone who died of uncertain causes, and some of his blood samples got frozen. And so decades later, after we had kind of discovered the HIV virus, they went back and tested this blood from 1959, and he did in fact have HIV. There were some sporadic probable cases here and there in Europe and the United States in both the 1950s and 1960s, which we only know about in hindsight. Nobody knew that this virus existed back then. And it was so infrequent that it was infecting people that nobody realized that this was a new disease until 1981, because by 1981, this virus had entered a specific sub-community of persons in the United States and become very widespread in that particular sub-community. And so this was this group of people who happened to be having a lot of sex without condoms, was a group of men who were having sex with men in San Francisco. So this article that I'm showing you the title from was from the New England Journal of Medicine in 1981. And so what the title of the article is talking about a pneumonia and mucosal candidiasis. You might be like, oh, Candida, we learned about that, right? It can cause a vaginitis, it can cause a vulvar infection, but it usually doesn't infect other places like your throat and your esophagus. And so they were seeing these very strange infections that normally do not occur in young, healthy people. They usually only occur in people with very advanced cancer or very compromised immune systems, people who have a lot of other medical problems. So this was very strange. All of a sudden they started seeing these weird, strange, unusual, and serious infections in previously healthy men who had sex with men. So researchers then started to kind of try to figure out why were these men getting these really strange infections. And it took them a while to figure it out, but eventually they did, and they discovered this virus that was causing the problem called HIV. So HIV stands for human immunodeficiency virus. So immunodeficiency means it causes a deficient or defective immune system. That's why they were getting these weird infections. It is impossible to underestimate or to understate how devastating this illness was on this community. So this image that we're seeing here shows you, so there was in San Francisco a gay men's choir at the time. And they're showing you in this image, the men in white are the surviving members of the original choir. Everyone else, everyone who's in a black shirt in this photo died from HIV infection and AIDS, which is the illness that it causes. So by the time we figured out what was going on, massive numbers of previously young, healthy people were dying. This was a catastrophic loss for this community. In response to this huge unfolding tragedy, we saw some grassroots activism. So we're all pretty accustomed now to seeing different colored ribbons, especially the pink ribbon for breast cancer awareness. But that kind of grassroots and public awareness campaigns actually began with HIV and with the red ribbon. And so that was the beginnings of trying to get the word out and saying, hey, there's something going on. We need to pay attention to this. We need to figure out what it is. We need to figure out how to prevent it, and we need to figure out how to treat it. And so we started seeing a lot more activism from the LGBT community at that time. So we can see this image here, silence equals death. So that pink triangle was a symbol for gay men. And so they're saying, you know, we need to be talking about this, right? We need to be having these conversations with our partners. We were starting to figure out that this was sexually transmitted disease. And then an organization called ACT UP also started along with others. And these were some of the first grassroots organizations that were formed to not only increase public awareness, but also to raise money, as well as pressure the government to fund research into this particular illness. Because when this first happened, it was in, right, a marginalized community. And so initially at the time, our federal government and the National Institutes of Health and the CDC, they didn't get involved, right? They just kind of let this play out and let it happen. But these groups really kind of started holding public officials accountable, and resulted in huge strides in HIV research, to the point where we are today is miles beyond where we ever thought we would be with this particular disease. So this is all of that information in text form. I also want to point out that when treatment first became available, also it cost over $10,000. So one of the other goals of these organizations was to make treatments available and accessible and affordable for people, which was also hugely important in reducing the spread and saving lives. So when we look at the diagnoses of AIDS, which is the illness caused by HIV virus, we can see that, you know, we didn't know that it existed really before the early 1980s. So there are, you know, very few cases. So diagnoses then, huge increase into the early 90s while we were still researching and trying to understand this illness. Also then huge increase in the number of deaths over the same period of time. And then you'll notice that then after the 90s, we had a huge decrease. And so we've already talked about this a little bit because we saw decreases in other STIs as well. So we started getting the public health message out there that people needed to use condoms. The safer sex messaging was very strong at this time. So I happened to go to college for the first time as a freshman in 1990. And it was required, every single entering freshman had to learn how to use a condom. Our RAs had to demonstrate it for us. We all had to demonstrate that we could do it. It was required of every single college student. This was in New York City at the time. So this huge campaign for safer sex, and it was very effective because we didn't have treatments initially. So, but through those public health measures, through increasing safer sex, we were able to significantly decrease the number of diagnoses and therefore deaths from this illness. So how do you get it? So I've already alluded that it's sexually transmitted. It's in the unit on STIs, so obviously it's sexually transmitted. But basically you get HIV when infected secretions or body fluids come into contact with either intact mucous membranes or broken skin. So we'll break this down and talk more in detail about it in a minute. I just want to point out before we do that you cannot catch HIV from Oliver the TA, my cat. So there's an in-class assignment for those of you who are in my course where you need to tell me what Oliver is doing today. So there is your answer. So HIV is this virus that can be transmitted via infected blood and body fluids. So semen, breast milk, vaginal secretions, and blood, right? So these are all carrying the virus. Saliva does not carry much, if any, of the virus, so it's not considered a way to transmit the virus. And then those infected blood or body fluids come in contact with either intact mucous membranes, and our primary mucous membranes are the vagina, the anus, and the urethra, or broken skin, right? So if you have a cut and it can get into your bloodstream through broken skin, or directly into your bloodstream via a blood transfusion or IV drug use, injection drug use. So therefore, you can get HIV from blood transfusions prior to 1992, because prior to 1992, we didn't really know what this virus was and we had no way to test for it. So this image in the upper right of the cover of People magazine had a feature article on Ryan White. Ryan White was a young boy who got infected with HIV as a result of a blood transfusion in the 1980s. He died from HIV and AIDS, and his story was really powerful because at that time there was a lot of fear and there was a lot of stigma about this illness. It was also called the gay man's cancer, right? There was all kinds of shame and stigma and fear about it. And so Ryan White, when he got diagnosed with HIV and got sick with it, his school didn't allow him to go to school, and then finally when they did, none of the other kids would sit near him, none of them would talk to him, nobody would play with him. People were very afraid of getting the virus just by being near somebody or by touching them, which we know this is an STI, right? So you cannot get infected that way. It requires intimate contact. But initially there was so much fear and stigma that people who had HIV were horribly discriminated against and shunned from society. But so you could get it from blood transfusions. You can't anymore. Donor blood is now tested for HIV. You can get it through sex, of course, right? And so your likelihood of getting the virus, so transmission is higher. If your mucous membranes, you can still get infected if they're intact, but if they're inflamed or damaged, that increases your risk. So for that reason, anal receptive intercourse, anal sex, has a higher risk than vaginal sex because that anal mucosa is a little less resilient than vaginal. So I just want to remind you of that squamocolumnar junction, which we've talked about before. And so over here we have stratified squamous epithelium. That's what we find lining the inside of the vagina. It's many, many cell layers thick, so it's durable and resilient. The outer portion of the anus also has stratified squamous epithelium and a squamocolumnar junction, but the internal anal canal and rectum has just this single layer of cells, this simple columnar epithelium. So it tends to be much less resilient, more delicate, and so more prone to little micro tears, little bits of bleeding, irritation, inflammation. Also, if you have other STIs, if you have some herpes sores, it is more likely that you could catch HIV because you have these irritated and damaged mucous membranes. And as we've discussed before, spermicide, by causing irritation, can increase the likelihood of HIV transmission because it causes irritation of those tissues. One of the reasons why, if you have other alternatives, we do not recommend spermicide. You can get HIV as a fetus from your mother. So there's kind of that in utero transmission. You can also get HIV from breastfeeding from an infected mother. Also, of course, intravenous drug use can transmit the virus if needles are being shared between different users. And needle stick injuries in healthcare, right? So if I am doing a procedure on somebody else with a needle and I inject, it goes into their body and then I accidentally stick myself, I could potentially get HIV from that. That's not common, but it can occur. So what we're looking at on this slide is a chart from the CDC of your exposure risk by route. So on the left side we have exposure route, and then on the right side it tells us the estimated number of people that would get infected per every 10,000 of those types of exposures. So if you get a blood transfusion from someone who has HIV, you have a 90% chance of getting HIV. It lives in the immune cells, and the immune cells are circulating in your bloodstream. So that's a really high risk. Mother to child, including pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding, very high, 25% risk of transmission. What's really interesting, however, is that if they have access to treatment, which we'll discuss in the next section, that risk drops to 1 to 2%. This is a medical miracle. This is amazing and wonderful that we can prevent newborns from getting infected with HIV. And then if you look at all of the other behaviors, the risks are all less than 2%, sometimes very much less than, right? So here's needle sharing with injection drug use, less than 1%. Here's anal receptive intercourse, so being the receptive partner, the partner whose anus is being penetrated. The risk in this particular study was slightly less than 2%. This other study, it was only 0.5%. If you are the insertive partner here, so your risk is somewhere from 0.1 to 0.6% per act, right? And of course that adds up over time statistically. And then here is receptive vaginal intercourse. So if you're the person who has the vagina, 0.1%. Penetrative vaginal intercourse, so if you're the person with the penis, 0.05%, which makes sense, right? Because the urethra, which is your mucous membrane, there's just a little tiny bit of it that is kind of exposed, whereas if you have a vagina, that's a lot of surface area that could be infected. And then down here, this is the risk of catching the virus from performing unprotected oral sex or a blowjob, right? So if somebody ejaculates into your mouth, you can get infected that way. And then finally, this one here is the risk from getting infected if somebody performs oral sex on you, specifically fellatio or oral sex on a man in this example. And you can see it's 0.005%. And in most of all those cases, the person who was performing oral sex had some gum inflammation or some small cuts on the inside of their mouth that facilitated the transfer of the infection. We haven't been able to document that saliva alone is able of transmitting the virus. So, in summary, HIV first occurred in Africa, but didn't occur with any frequency until in the 80s. It somehow got introduced into a community in San Francisco of men having sex with men that were not using condoms, right? This was a time when, they didn't have to worry about pregnancy. STIs were believed to be totally treatable. We discovered antibiotics for chlamydia and gonorrhea, so there was not a focus on safer sex, and this virus spread like wildfire throughout that community, killing hundreds of, if not thousands of people. And initially nobody really knew what was causing it, and it took a lot of time to figure out that it was a virus, and there was a lot of fear and stigma. There was no treatment available. We weren't sure how it was being transmitted. It was a very scary time. We saw the rise of ACT UP and other groups that became activists to raise awareness, to promote safer sex, and then to fund research and hold government institutions and organizations accountable for actually working on this problem. And then we talked about transmission. So infected body fluids, so semen, vaginal fluids, blood, that come into contact either with broken skin or intact mucous membranes. So blood transfusions before 1992, not now. Sex, injection drug use, and mother to child in utero or during breastfeeding are the ways HIV is transmitted. So we'll pick up in 25D talking about what the infection is and the symptoms it causes, as well as how it is treated.